Thank you everyone for attending our April VISTA training event. This month we are going over public speaking, and we are joined by the Director of Communications for Hunger Free America, Kim Moscaritolo. And I will pass the mic over to you, Kim, and let you take it from there.
Sure, thank you. Hey, everybody. I'm Kim, Director of Communications Advocacy here at HFA, and I'm excited to be here. I have a little presentation that I'm going to share in just a moment, but I know we're kind of an intimate group, so also hope there'll be some opportunity for me to find out from you, what you're hoping to get out of this training. And also, there'll be, I think, plenty of time for you to ask me questions too. And if, something pops up on the screen that you have a specific question about and you want to raise your hand, that's fine with me. I think we can be kind of informal. So yeah, with that, I will start sharing my screen. Give me 1 second. All right. Can everyone see the presentation? Great. Awesome. All right. So this is our public speaking training. It's kind of fun doing these on Zoom. I used to do, just so you know, when I was in college, I did a lot of speech and debate. It was all in person, of course. It was a long time ago. And I actually don't know these days if they do any of it remotely or on Zoom. So it's a little bit, it's interesting to try to do this and sort of talk about public speaking when we're not, in the same room as each other. But we're gonna give it the old college try. So yeah, the purpose of this training is to learn how to improve your public speaking skills. And Robert tells me that this is something that several of you have asked about and have an interest in, so that's great. So we're going to go over three main areas: preparation, practice, and then we're going to talk some tips and tricks. And by the way, this isn't a super detailed presentation, but if anyone is interested in it after the fact, I'm more than happy to send it over to Robert to share with everybody. So first up is preparation. To me, I think this is it's the most important part of learning about public speaking. I think there's misconception that, oh, people can just sort of get up and give a great speech or talk off the cuff or, talk from the heart. And that's a really great idea, but there are very, very few people in this world who can actually really do that and do that effectively. And the truth is, I think even when you see people who it seems like they're sort of talking off of the cuff, they're actually probably have prepared and just are really good at it and are able to make it seem that way. So I just can't stress enough how much being prepared is like one of the most important things you can do when you're talking about getting ready to give a big public speech. So how do you prepare? It's a few questions I think that you want to ask yourself. Obviously, it's important to know what you're going to be talking about. Is it a topic that you know a lot about already? Is it something you have to do research on? It seems like a basic thing, but it's an important question to ask yourself. And also to ask yourself, if it's a really broad topic, do you want to, maybe talk about a few key aspects of it? Because sometimes when you have this big, huge subject, like talking about science, like science is huge. So, asking yourself really what it is you want to talk about and breaking it down. Who's your audience? This is really an important question because I think in a lot of ways this determines what you focus on in your speech, how you communicate the information. Are you talking to a room full of potential donors to an organization? Are you talking to the news media? It's really important to ask that question. And then finally, what's the goal, right? So what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to persuade people about something? Are you trying to get them to donate money to your organization? Whatever it is, you just want to be really clear about what your goal is. So what's your topic? Like I said, it would be great if this is something that you know a lot about. But even if you do know a lot about something, I still cannot emphasize enough how important it is to do your research and to create an outline and really lay out your speech. And this is really important. Um, there's sort of this old saying, it's, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about how you want to set up a speech. So that means, giving a really clear introduction and laying it out. This is what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to talk about this and this and this. And then you go into your speech, and one by one, you hit all the points that you mentioned in your introduction. And then you're going to come back to your conclusion and you're going to say, today we talked about this, we discussed this, we examined this, and we looked to the future to see what is next on the horizon. Really laying it out for your audience so that they know what to expect, and that they remember what you told them. So, laying out your speech ahead of time, creating an outline for what you want to say, I think is extremely important. I actually just went over this, so I don't need to go over this too much, but a good way to lay out your speech, obviously, is to have the introduction, focusing on two or three really important points. You don't want to overwhelm your audience. Generally speaking, unless we're talking about like a really long seminar or something, you're probably speaking anywhere between like 5 and 10 minutes. And so 2 to 3 points, I think, is the real sweet spot for what people are comfortable getting. If you notice, this presentation has 3 things that we're going to talk about. I think rule of threes is really important for speeches. And obviously, you're going to conclude by recapping everything that you just spoke about. One thing I will say, and this is hard to get across on the Zoom, but if we were all in the same room, I would talk a little bit about using your physical space to do something that in speech and debate we call signposting. Has anybody heard that term before or know what it is in relation to giving a speech? So the way we would use that term is if I was going to talk about like what my first point is, I would say, we're going to do this by first, and then I would gesture to my right, let's say. And then when I go to talk about that thing, I would walk to my right, like basically to where I gestured. And so you're sort of giving this subconscious instruction to the audience of saying, okay, when I talk about this, I'm going to walk over here, and then I'm going to walk over there. And then second, and then you walk to where you gestured to. So it's just sort of a little unconscious assistance that you give to your audience to let them know that, okay, when I'm over here, I'm going to be talking about this. And then when I'm over here, I'm going to be talking about this. So that's sort of a really good way to, use that signposting and really lay it out for your audience. Okay, who is your target audience? I mentioned this a little bit in the previous slide, but this is really important. Is your target audience the news media? A lot of times in my job here at HFA, this is oftentimes our main audience, right? We're sending out media advisories and press releases. We're trying to get the press somewhere. And so then when they show up, whether it's to a press conference, to some sort of event that we're doing, or just an interview, want to make sure that our focus is really clear, right? We're trying to get coverage for this really important stuff that Hunger Free America does. And so in order to do that, want to make sure that we're hitting all of our points, that we're making it something that the news media is going to want to cover, making sure that it's timely. Maybe we tie it to something that's going on in the world. Right now, everyone's obviously talking a lot about what's happening in the federal government with cuts and tariffs and all these things. And so if we can tie what we do and the struggles of people who we know to these sort of big stories that are happening nationally, that's a really great way to get people's attention. And it's a really great way to get the press interested in what you're talking about. Is your audience just sort of, random people at home who maybe are interested in a topic? And if that's the case, you may want to adjust your talking points a little bit, right? Maybe it's a little bit more general. The average person may not know a lot about like the specifics of the SNAP program or the funding for this or that. So you may want to lay out your points in terms that, average everyday people can understand, maybe by, telling a story about somebody or, tying it to something in their lives. And as I said before, donors, and this is really important. If you are talking to a room full of folks who may want to donate money to your organization, you want to think about figuring out how to tailor the message to them. Why should they give money to your organization over all these other organizations? What's the specific benefit to them? What are they going to accomplish by donating to you as opposed to, say, any of the other great organizations? So I just say this to let you know that you really need to be conscious of who your audience is. And in doing that, I think you can really tailor your message in a way that's going to be really effective. And finally, yeah, what's the goal, right? Do we want to educate? Do we want to inspire? Do we want to convince people of something? These are all reasons, these are all goals that people might have when they're giving a speech, right? If you're giving, a best man speech at a wedding, obviously, that is a little bit different than, say, giving an academic speech on an important topic, that you want to let people know about. So really keep that goal in mind when you're thinking about how you want to lay out your speech and the points that you want to make. Um, so the next section we're going to go into is practice. But I know that after a few minutes of somebody talking at you, it gets a little bit, it can get a little bit tough. And I wanted to try to make it a little bit interactive. And so I know we're going to get questions from folks later. But what I really wanted to ask folks here, since Robert said several of you had asked for this kind of training, is if folks just want to raise their hand and maybe let me know if there are specific events or specific situations that maybe you've either had to speak at, or maybe it's something upcoming or something that you think you might do, and kind of let me know, what those things are, and perhaps why you want to learn a little bit more about public speaking. So are you, like I said, are you going to be giving a best man speech or, a speech at somebody's wedding? Are you going to be presenting to a classroom or to volunteers? Does anybody have something that they've recently done or that's upcoming that requires public speaking and you're, want to learn a little bit more to be able to be more confident in doing that? I know the first question is always tough. Nobody wants to be first. Nobody's had to public speak anywhere recently. I don't believe that for 1 second.
Okay.
Anybody? Anybody?
Okay,
I
me.
knew. I knew I was going to get
Me.
somebody. I
Me,
just
me,
had to
me,
bill y'all into it. Thank you.
me. So okay, I gotta tell you a funny story real quick.
Okay.
So I was doing a tabling event for the organization that I'm at right now, and they actually told me that no speech was required. But
Oh,
we were sitting there and the host of the party was like, um, it was like a food drive and tabling event for Boulder Food Rescue. And he was like, okay, so we're gonna need, telling everybody what is good to donate, this, that, and the other. And then he was like, and I just want to thank you guys for showing up. And I'm gonna go ahead and just send it off to Devana. And I was like, um, I wasn't ready because they said in the email, no speech required.
yeah.
So I threw something out there that was beautiful and personal, and it worked out great. But I
Oh,
was
good.
so not ready for that. But it was still fun.
Well, first of all, it sounds like you handled it very well. So
Yeah.
congratulations.
Thanks.
The good thing is in a situation where you are there on behalf of an organization you really care about and know a lot about, a lot of times we have a lot of good information to pull from. So even if we weren't expecting to give a speech and even if it's not the most like beautifully laid out speech, we can usually, be very effective. But yeah, you talked a little bit about a personal story, and I think that's so important. We when we would do speech and debate, we would do what was called impromptu speeches. So, you're kind of given a topic and you had like a couple of minutes to prepare, and you didn't really know what the topic was going to be ahead of time. So, but the reality is, especially if you do it more and more, you kind of have a few, I would say, sort of like what we call canned stories or canned speeches, in that, you know, you've done this before, you know, you have a story kind of in your back pocket of like, oh, I can tell this story about, you know, this family that needed our help and we were able to help them. And I think that sort of goes along with what is going to be the next topic that we're dealing with, which is practice, right? Which is, yeah, you know, you may not always be expecting to have to get up and give a speech, and hopefully no one expects, you know, like a 10 or 15-minute treatise on something, but you know, always having maybe like one or two stories that you can go to, you know, a 30-second pitch. We talk about the elevator pitch. You know, that's the idea, is like if you find yourself on an elevator with somebody, like 30 seconds to tell them all about what you're doing before, you know, they get to their floor. I think it's always good to have that sort of 30-second to 60-second elevator pitch always sort of ready to go. The truth is, you never know, especially in the nonprofit world, when you're going to be in a situation where you might have an incredible opportunity to talk to somebody. You know, maybe they're a big donor who, you know, you happen to run into them at an event or, you know, at something, and having that sort of that, you know, that information and that story ready to go is so important, because when you do find yourself in that situation, you know, you have it ready, you've given it before, you've practiced it before. You know, the worst thing in the world is to like have that opportunity and then they walk away and you're like, oh, I should have said this thing about, I could have gotten them, or, you know, I could have gotten their email and like sent them information. So I think, you know, always, even if you think like, oh, my job has nothing to do with public speaking, but truth is, you never know who you're going to be in a room with. You're never going to know when you're going to have the opportunity to really sell your organization and maybe get more support. So I think, you know, having a good story, and some good facts and information always sort of at the ready is a really, really important thing. Um, so that was great. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it sort of segues very nicely into our next section, which is practice. This is so important. Um, as I write here, so many people think, oh, I'm just going to wing it. Oh, I know this stuff. I'll just, you know, I'll get up there and I'll just talk for a few minutes. And you don't realize until you're up there, you know, suddenly you get nervous. Your adrenaline starts pumping, your heart starts beating really fast. You get nervous. You'd be amazed. Things that you thought you knew kind of fly out of your head. There's a word you're trying to think of and you can't think of it. You like make eye contact with somebody and it throws you off. Like there's just so many ways to get thrown off. And so I think the key to not having that happen is to have practiced, because it's like anything else. If you do it enough and you practice it enough and it kind of becomes second nature, then whatever else is going on that kind of throws you, you know, there's noise, you're at a restaurant trying to give a speech and there's noise in the kitchen and it's really, you know, distracting. But if you really know your speech backwards and forward and you've practiced it a bunch of times and you've said it a bunch of times, you can usually deal with those distractions and still get through it. So there's some ways to practice, right? I mean, the obvious one is in front of a mirror, and it seems silly, and it's weird to kind of look at yourself and be talking. But I think it's really great, because when you look in a mirror, you can sort of see how other people see you, and so you can also see, how do my hand gestures look? You know, am I closing my eyes too much? Am I looking down too much? So I think starting off by practicing in a mirror is really important. Obviously, technology, we all have our phones. I think recording yourself and watching it back can be a really useful tool. You know, one of the hardest things, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, is hearing your voice back for the first time when you've recorded yourself, because the way we hear ourselves in our head is not often the way we actually sound to people. And so I think, you know, recording yourself and getting a sense of how you sound to others can also be really helpful in terms of helping you to craft your speech and know how to speak. Do I need to speak a little more loudly? Do I need to lower my voice? Do I need to speak more slowly? So I think recording yourself is really valuable. And then finally, doing it in front of a friend. This is probably the hardest one because it can seem really embarrassing, especially if you're one on one. Asking your friend to sit there while you're giving a speech can be a little bit daunting. But the fact is, when you're doing this in real life, you're going to be talking to a group of people. And I think it's valuable to know not only how it feels to speak in front of a real person, but also you get their feedback, and they can tell you, this was good, it dragged on a little bit here, and you were a little soft in this part, you may want to raise your voice a little bit. I think it's really, really helpful to get that feedback. So I think these are the best ways to really practice. One thing that a lot of folks do is reading the speech, and it depends on how long the speech is. I'm not a big fan of reading a speech word for word. Um, Absolutely, if you're going to do a speech, I think you should write it out. And I think the first few times you do it, obviously, you're going to be reading it because you haven't committed it to memory. But I think one of the best things you can do is, to the best of your ability, try to commit it to memory. And if you can't remember it word for word, one thing you can do is on a piece of paper write concepts, right? So, a few key ideas that you want to make sure you get across that'll remind you of what's written in the speech can be really good. But I think that when folks just read through the entire speech, like word for word, and never look up, I think it really keeps you from engaging with your audience. And audiences, I think, want that engagement. They want your eye contact. They want to, feel like they're a part of it. So I would say, to the degree that you can, I know not everyone is great at memorizing things, and I'm not saying you have to do it completely with like no notes or anything, but I think putting it to memory the best you can is, if you have the time to do that, I think can be really effective. Um, One other thing, I didn't write it in this presentation, but one thing that's very common right now, I see this all the time. If like giving testimony at the city council or at press conferences or whatever, is folks have it written on their phones and they read off of their phones. And this could just be me being old school. I'm Gen X, like pre cell phones, but I actually find it really frustrating when I'm watching someone speak and they're like just looking down at their phone. And it's hard because, the phone is small. So usually you have to like be kind of close to it to read all the words. So you're like, your face is sort of buried in your phone. People lose their place. Inevitably, sleep mode goes on. They lose their place. They have to like restart the phone and put in the code, which kind of throws it off. So I will just tell you my personal opinion on this, and if folks have other thoughts, would love to hear it in the discussion. Is if you can avoid it, try not to read your speech off of a phone. Even printing it out on paper, if you have access to a printer, I think is better, because you can print in large font and you can have it far away from you, and you'll tend to like look up more. I just feel like when people's faces are in their phones, it's really hard, I think, to also connect with an audience. So the next section I wanted to go to was tips and tricks. So these are just some things that over the years I've come to think are sort of the best ways to both prepare for giving a speech and also, when you're in the moment, how to give a speech. So the first thing on here is try to write the speech the way you speak. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times if you see like a really great speaker, they give a speech and it sounds like they're just, speaking off the top of their head, because the way they're speaking sounds so natural and the way you would speak in conversation. But a big part of that is just they really prepare and they write it the way they speak. So I think it's important, if you speak a certain way, if you make jokes, if you, however it is that you speak, you can write an initial draft of your speech that's, full of facts, and you can have all that stuff. But then really think about how you would deliver it if you were just having a conversation with somebody. And you can write it that way. You can use contractions and you can write when you write something, you might write going to, but if you say gonna, you can write, write it the way you normally talk, because then when you're committing it to memory, number one, it's easier to memorize if it's the way you speak. And number two, it just sounds more natural when you're delivering it. So I always recommend writing speech in the way that you speak. I think that's really important. Hand gestures are really important. And again, this is one of those things that would be a lot easier if we were in the same room. So I'm going to try to do my best here. But I think hand gestures can be incredibly effective. But the key is, I think you want to use them intentionally and sparingly. And this is something that when I started doing speech and debate, I actually had a lot of issues with. I don't know about other people. I'm Italian, talk with our hands a lot. We're always going like this all the time. It's like, ah. And I remember my coach, the way she basically trained it out of me was she would literally take a piece of string and tie my hands to my side, so that even if I wanted to move them, I couldn't. And she would make me give like a full 10-minute speech with my hands tied to my side. So I couldn't move them. It was awful because you want to emphasize things, you want to use your hands. But if you use it too much, then you're just sort of doing this all the time. What you really want to do is you want to use your hand gestures to really emphasize something. So really think about it intentionally. And actually, when I would, do pre-written speeches, I would actually note where I think it might make sense to use a hand gesture, right? So if I was talking about something and I was talking about the entire world, right? I might do something like the entire world, like, again, like those subconscious clues to the audience. Like, one, this is important because I'm using hand gestures and I'm also sort of mimicking what I'm talking about, can be really effective. Um, when I say be intentional, it also means, and again, this is hard to show on the Zoom, but you don't want kind of the lazy hand, like, oh, my finger here and here and here. If you're going to gesture, keep your fingers together. This is important. This is why I am using my hands, and you should be listening to this. So, all of this kind of goes back to practice and preparation. If you're thinking about these things ahead of time, you can figure out where you want to do this in your speech, and it can be incredibly effective. Making eye contact. This is an important thing. It can be hard. It feels weird to look someone straight in the eye, especially if you're in person while you're giving a speech, and it's like, am I looking at this person too much? Is it getting creepy now? I've looked at this person's eyes for too long. One trick that I've used in the past is if it's really uncomfortable to look directly at people, finding like a little spot on the wall in the back of the room really close to somebody, especially if you're giving a speech from the front of the room, it kind of mimics eye contact, but you're not actually looking directly into somebody's eyes. I think that is a good way of, still engaging with your audience, still looking at your audience, but not necessarily, making uncomfortable eye contact with lots of people. How to ease your nerves. So this is a hard one because, as I said in the beginning, especially if you're not used to speaking in front of people, or if it's like a really important speech, I get nervous. We all get nervous. I think, aside from just doing it over and over again, which is one of the ways you get over your nerves, one of the things that happens when people speak in public is they end up talking really fast. So a long time ago, somebody told me, and I don't actually know if this is scientifically accurate, so take it for what it's worth. It might be an urban legend. But someone once told me the reason we talk so fast when we're nervous is that our heartbeat is like our natural metronome. And when we're nervous, the heart starts beating really fast. And without even realizing it, you start talking really fast because you're nervous and your heart's beating really fast. And so one of the best pieces of advice that I was given early on was right before I'm about to go speak is to just take a few really deep breaths, like 3 or 4 really deep breaths. Try to slow your heartbeat down. because that will help you as you start to give your speech to, make sure that you're not starting the speech at like 100 miles a minute. I'll also say this, and goes back to why we maybe want to record ourselves and watch ourselves back. I can promise you that if you are hearing yourself and you think you're talking too slowly, you're probably speaking at just the right speed. We always think, people, when we're talking really fast, like we think we're talking at a normal speed and everyone can understand us. We're always talking faster than we think we are. So taking those few breaths, calming yourself down, and really starting your speech in a really intentional and slow way, I think is a really great way to overcome some of those nerves and overcome the really speaking quickly. Just go over some don'ts. I think I alluded to all of these things, but I'll just reiterate them. Yeah, don't use your hands too much. If you're using them constantly, it means nothing, and it's kind of just becomes distracting. So if you're going to use hand motions, make them deliberate and intentional, and use them to really accentuate something you're saying. As I said, try really hard not to read from your phone. I know sometimes it's inevitable, all of a sudden you get called up to speak and you weren't expecting to, and that's really hard. But if you can avoid using your phone, I would avoid it. And then finally, what I just said, which is try to avoid speaking too quickly. Take a second, take a deep breath, slow yourself down. I think it's always better to speak a little more slowly and deliberately than to speak so fast that people can't really understand you. Do connect with your audience, as we said, and that can be either through making eye contact, smiling, but it can also be in terms of what you talk about. So knowing your audience, and if maybe it's telling a really personal story that will connect with people, or talking about something that is particularly timely, that people are going to really want to engage with. There's lots of ways to connect with your audience, so really think about who you're speaking to, and think about ways to connect with them. And the final thing, obviously, is you want to project. It's hard, to sometimes speak to a big room in particular. Hopefully you have a microphone, but if you don't, you just want to make sure that you're speaking loudly enough that people, can hear you even in the back of the room. So I think that's really important. Let's go through some final thoughts, and then I'll stop talking at you guys, and I would love to, do a little back and forth and see what questions folks have. Obviously, know your audience, prepare, do your research, write your speech out, practice it. I cannot emphasize this enough. Practice, practice, practice. You're going to really be glad that you did, because as I said, when something unexpected happens, when there's a noise, whatever, something happens in the room, if you really practiced and know your speech backwards and forward, it's really going to help you get through those difficult moments. And then finally, have fun. It's hard. I know some people are so afraid of public speaking, but it can be really fun if you let yourself really engage with the audience, especially if you're talking about something you know a lot about. That's great. You're sharing your knowledge and your experience with people, and that's a really special thing. So, think of it that way and have fun. And also know that, like, most people don't like public speaking. And so, it's everyone wants you to do well. So don't feel like, oh, this is going to be terrible. Just think positively, have fun, and it's going to be great. With that, that's pretty much the end of my sort of, official presentation. I would just love to hear from folks. If you have questions for me, or again, if there's maybe a specific event or something that you're preparing for or want to know about, and maybe I can give you some tips or guide you through it. So Robert, I'll pass it over to you, but however you want to do it. But I would just love to hear from some folks.
Well, great. Well, thank you for that. I feel like I've benefited a lot from participating in this training, so that's a little selfish on my end. And I think I caught myself even in the introduction. I hate when I hear myself say or
Mm-hmm.
like the placeholders, they're like the pausing, and I find that I do that a lot when I feel like the camera's on me, and I don't know if there's any. I mean, I'm cognizant of it, but like, is there anything to? I guess that's just something you can practice out of your speech, but
Yeah. First of all, I'm guilty of that too when I'm speaking sort of off the cuff, and we do it for a reason, right? Like we're trying to formulate our next thought, and it feels weird to have silence, so we put these and it's like so, and really you're just trying to come up with your next thought, right? It's a sort of a time wasting exercise. So I think you're right. I think the key to avoiding that is preparing ahead of time. If you've written out your speech, even if you don't deliver it word for word, and lots of people don't, I don't always deliver it word for word, but if you practice it enough times and you kind of know this is what's coming next, this is the next topic, um, it just means that there's not as much of you trying to think of the next thing to say. And I think inevitably you're going to limit it. But I would also say, this is where recording yourself can really come in handy, because I feel like a lot of times we don't even know that we're doing it. And so I think if you can record yourself speaking or giving a speech and you can listen back to it, and it gives you, when you actually see or hear yourself doing it, I think it makes you more aware. And the more I just said, and the more aware of it you are, the more you can think about it in the moment and address it. I would also say don't fear a second or two of silence. I think we all in today's society is like constant sort of sounds, and we want to always be like hearing something or seeing something. I think it is totally okay as you're formulating a thought to take a second or two to think about it and then say the next thing. And maybe that would be helpful in terms of avoiding, the and all that. Everybody does it. Obviously, it's more common when you're trying to formulate thoughts and you're kind of speaking off the cuff. So I would say the key is probably just preparing ahead of time and making sure that you practice.
we'll definitely incorporate that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
So I
Mhm.
have I don't know, as far as how much honesty to give the
Mhm.
audience when doing a speech, because I still see like meetings like this and training with people that if it's a meeting like this, it's more than one, like a one-on-one, I
Mhm.
still consider it public speaking in a way.
Mhm.
Um, and so what I did, I had my first new volunteer orientation that I facilitated on my own because I'm a big girl now, and it was really awesome. But I had written notes as I was using slides, and the
Mhm.
slides were like kind of giving me the, like the topic of where I should. And because I was still kind of new to it, I was still referring to my notes a bit. So I was being honest with them. I'm like, look, this is my first NVO on my own, and I still need my notes just a little bit, but I don't want to miss out on giving you all the information needed in this training.
Mhm.
So if I don't know how honest you can be when you're doing public speaking, it's still depending on your notes, but that's where I'm at.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think, look, everyone has been in that situation. We've all had a first time when we were leading a training or, talking to volunteers or, talking to our coworkers, doing a presentation. It can be nerve-wracking. And like I said, part of the reason I harp on the idea of practice so much is that you can know a topic backwards and forwards. You probably knew everything that you needed to say. Like you were probably an expert on it, but it's being in the moment, suddenly having all the eyes on you. It again, that adrenaline starts pumping, and things that leave your head because that's just how we are when we're in front of people. It's a natural instinct. And so I think number one, it is totally okay to be honest. I think showing a little bit of honesty and vulnerability up front, I think puts people at ease. I think sometimes, I experience this too, where like, I just think of myself as like, I'm just me. I'm just Kim. I'm like, kind of a dummy sometimes, and I don't know what I'm doing. I think we all have that like imposter syndrome of like, I don't know what I'm doing. And the reality is you're talking to a group of people, and in their mind, you are an expert, and maybe you're intimidating to them, and they think, oh my God. So, understand that people don't always see you the way you see yourself. And if they are listening to you, it's because they think you have something really important to say. And so, you can own that and be confident in that. But I think being a little bit vulnerable with people is also helpful because maybe it, brings down their guard a little bit, makes them less nervous. Maybe it makes them more apt to be willing to ask questions and engage because they're not as nervous anymore. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think just the more you do it, the more comfortable you're going to get. So, by the time you do your fifth training or whatever it is, you've done this, the ropes, you know how this presentation goes. You're just going to get better at it. There's no question. Nobody's going to come out of the gate first time and be awesome. You just keep trying it, you keep practicing it. But being honest and being vulnerable, I think, can be really effective in helping you to build a connection with your audience. Anyone else have anything?
Did ask a question in the text
Oh,
chat.
thank you. It's not looking at the chat.
How do you get better at formulating coherent responses to unexpected questions?
What a great question. This is a tough one. You obviously you try to prepare as much as possible, for every potential question, especially if you're giving a speech on a particular topic. You do your research, you try to know as much about it as possible. Inevitably, you're going to get a question about something that maybe you didn't really prepare for, you don't really know a lot about. Listen, I think it is totally okay to talk about, being honest and vulnerable. I think it's totally okay to admit you maybe don't know something. I think, when someone asks you a question, if it's like a really thoughtful question that maybe requires a little bit of thinking, I think it's fine to say, that's a really good question. I want to think about that a little bit because I want to make sure that I give you the right answer. So give me a little bit of time to think about that and to think it through, and I will definitely get back to you with an answer on that. And if it's just a piece of information you don't know, this happens with reporters all the time. I try to be as up on all the statistics as I possibly can be, but I'm not Joel. I don't have all of the facts in my brain at all times. And so no matter how much I prepare, inevitably a reporter will, ask a question about some statistic that I just have no idea. I don't know how much this particular thing costs. I don't know what the hunger rates in this particular city are off the top of my head. I just say to them, that's a really good question. Let me find the answer and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. There is no shame in not knowing the answer to every single question. Um, it's totally okay to say, I don't know, let me find out and get back to you. And then you use that as a learning experience. So next time you do a speech, you've now learned that information and maybe you're a little bit more prepared. But I don't think anyone can expect anyone to have all the answers. So I think it's fine to admit when you don't know something. And I also think it's okay to sometimes do a little bit of a pivot, depending on what the question is. If it's a more general, open-ended question, maybe you shift over to something that you are prepared to talk about and you say, I'm not an expert on that, but let me tell you what I know about this. And then you can pivot to the thing that you really do know something about. And that's really effective also. You're welcome. Anyone else? If after this, if you think of any questions that didn't pop into your head, but you're like, oh, I wish I'd asked that, obviously, um, you know, Robert and Amy have all of my contact info, and I'm more than happy to respond to any emails or, if you have anything else. If something comes up and you're like, oh, I want to know about this, obviously you're more than welcome to shoot me an email and ask.
Well, thank you so much for this great presentation, and I'll make sure to get for anyone who wants to have these materials, that we get those to you. And just before everybody leaves, I'm gonna share our event evaluation form, and just we're a small group, so I would love to get 6 or 7. I think that's the amount of feedback evaluation. So just take 2 minutes and fill that out. And yeah, just thank you all for attending, and it's just great to gather like this and have events like this. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me, and thank you, everybody, for listening.